This is interesting, but also. Rusty looked at the game the summoners were playing while standing directly above it. Some kind of illusion spell generated the entire battlefield, making him feel like a giant looming over it. For several hours, he watched Gwen and Astrella lose to Arania. Eldrick and Aldrich took turns helping their leader, but neither proved particularly useful. In the end, it was Arania's quick thinking and strategic mind that secured her victory every time. How is this possible? Are these dice rigged? Astrella slammed both hands onto the edge of the board and stared at the glowing dice as though they had personally betrayed her. They are not. Arania answered calmly. They absolutely are. Every time I need reinforcements, I get terrible rolls, and every time you need something important, you somehow get exactly what you want. Perhaps the issue lies elsewhere. The spider girl delicately moved her swarm of hobgoblins to finish the game. Even though she had received the weakest faction available, she somehow won through careful planning alone. She always seemed to know exactly when to advance and when to retreat. The game itself was surprisingly complex, rewarding ambushes, terrain advantages, and proper positioning. Astrella, on the other hand, charged forward whenever possible, constantly chasing the strongest units without thinking things through. Gwen was more reserved and focused heavily on defense, which left her with fewer resources to build her armies. The game was surprisingly intricate and a good way to learn the fundamentals of warfare. It's over again. She won again. I've learned a lot. A faint chime echoed from the board. The battlefield dissolved into particles of light. No. Astrella stared at the empty board. As the game ended, everything returned to its original state. No way. She pointed at Arania while pouting. I want a rematch. Thou does? But thou hast already lost 5 times. While Astrella remained full of vigor, Arania looked exhausted. Her complexion was already ghostly pale, and she was even less physically fit than Gwen, who had steadily recovered since Rusty's first summoning. It was obvious she was tired, but something kept pushing her forward, as though she either could not or would not refuse the challenge. She also continued hiding much of her expression behind a dark purple fan whenever she interacted with the others. Astrella. I don't think we'll have time for another game. Look, the sun is starting to set. We should be close to our first stop. Gwen pointed toward the window. The bright orange glow that had illuminated the plains for most of the journey was fading. Long shadows stretched across the fields, and the floating stones overhead had become dark silhouettes against the evening sky. Rusty followed her gaze. Far ahead, beyond a gentle rise in the land, lights had begun to appear. At first, he thought they were stars. Then he realized they were far too large. What is that? The game board was quickly forgotten as everyone turned toward the windows. In the distance stood a humongous wall lined with lights, as though someone wanted it to be seen from miles away. It stretched across the horizon from one end of Rusty's vision to the other. Massive towers rose from it at regular intervals, each equipped with glowing parts that were beginning to shine. He could not see clearly from this angle, but he was certain the wall had been built for protection. The only question was, protection from what? Once we pass that wall, we will be in the outer lands. But don't be afraid, Gwen. I'll protect you if anything happens. Gwen chuckled as Rusty proclaimed this. He still had no idea how this world worked or where they were heading, but it was clear that once they passed through this gate, they would be entering a far more dangerous region. Perhaps that was where his true mission would begin. For the time being, everything had been rather boring. Rusty remained on the game board while the girls gazed out the window. Suddenly, he felt something. Some kind of intent seemed to be directed at him from behind. He quickly turned around and raised his small shield and halberd, only to discover something unexpected. Arania was reaching toward him with her hand, as if she intended to place it on his helmet. Her purple eyes were fixed on him. For a moment, it looked as though she might attack. Her nails were quite long, but they did not appear sharp or suited for cutting. What does she want? He watched in confusion as she suddenly stopped. Her expression remained completely still. Then, slowly, she withdrew her hand while a faint blush spread across her pale face. No one else seemed to notice what had happened. By the time they turned away from the window, Arania was already leaning back in her seat, hiding her face behind a fan. Even so, the tips of her ears had turned pink. Rusty, you have to see this. Look. Before he could continue wondering about Arania's strange behavior, Astrella grabbed his small body and carried him to the window. What had seemed enormous from a distance now appeared almost impossible to comprehend. The structure towered over the plains like an entire mountain range. He had no idea how humanoids could accomplish such a feat of craftsmanship, though magic was probably involved, as usual. Rusty estimated the wall to be hundreds of meters tall. Even now, as they approached, he could barely make out its upper reaches. Their wagon was far from the only vehicle heading toward it. Multiple glowing roads converged on massive gates set into the wall. Caravans, armored wagons, mounted riders, and even flying creatures flowed toward the entrances. The entire structure looked less like a fortification and more like a border separating kingdoms. It's huge. Rusty pressed his helmet against the glass. Are we going to go through it now? What does it look like on the other side? He asked as the vehicle began to slow down. No, silly. We'll be staying outside. Just look. Gwen pointed through the side window. Away from the main road stood a collection of buildings and crowds of people moving between them. Compared to the wall behind them, the structures looked tiny. Yet as the wagon drew closer, Rusty realized they were anything but small. Rows of stone buildings stretched across a vast clearing. Large inns stood beside stables capable of housing massive mounts. Warehouses, blacksmiths, and traders filled the area, making it resemble a proper town. Yet something was missing. There were no ordinary homes. It was as though the workers lived inside the businesses themselves, and the entire settlement existed only as a temporary stop for travelers passing through. It is called a way station. Gwen leaned closer to the window. Most people don't travel beyond the wall after sunset. The outer lands are too dangerous at night. So everyone stops here. Pretty much. There is also a fort on the other side, but it's more heavily guarded than this place. So danger lurks on the other side. Rusty clutched his small halberd as he looked at the wall again. Once they were on the other side, his work would probably begin. The girls, however, did not seem to take his concerns very seriously. You're being overly dramatic, Rusty. Nothing will happen to us. The professors will protect us, and the enchantments will keep the monsters away. It was reassuring to hear, but Rusty was not born yesterday. He knew enchantments could fail. Powerful and unexpected monster mutations were also a possibility. There was even the chance of a targeted attack. These were the children of nobles and powerful future summoners. There were probably people out there who wanted them dead. Otherwise, the academy would not be this heavily protected in the first place. Everyone, get ready. We will be departing shortly. Their conversation was interrupted by a burst of mana that deactivated all the silencing magic. It was Quinton, Class B1's teacher. His monocle shone brightly as he rose from his seat. The abrupt cancellation of the spell brought the sounds from outside rushing in and also caused the drooling Sibber to awaken. Hey! Ha! Look at this guy! He drooled all over himself. Astrella pointed at the boy, who quickly wiped his mouth with the sleeve of his school uniform. For a moment, he looked slightly disoriented, but he recovered with astonishing speed. His hair was fixed, his collar straightened, and he was sitting properly in an instant. Then he jolted upright and turned toward the window beside him. So we have arrived. Don't try to ignore me. Sibber did not turn his head, which only annoyed Astrella further as she continued pointing in his direction. Gwen grabbed her friend's hand and pulled her back. They needed to sit down and make sure they had not forgotten anything in the wagon. Now that the silencing spells were gone, the sounds from outside flooded in. They could hear people talking and various mounts snorting, along with the heavy creaking of wagons and the distant clang of metal being worked in the way station. Rusty climbed down from the board and onto Gwen's lap. Soon, the wagon came to a halt. Their teacher stood up first and went outside to speak with the others. Before long, the students were instructed to leave through the front, leaving their group as the last members of B1 to step outside. Let's go. My legs are feeling sore. Astrella commented, and Gwen nodded in agreement. Rusty was carried as he had been many times before, while Sibber remained the last to move. Arania, on the other hand, stayed in the middle of the group, making it look as though the others had placed her there for protection, like a noble lady under guard. So this is a way station. Once outside, Rusty started looking around. Some things were quite different from the place he came from, such as the floating islands and the various creatures, but there were also many similarities. The level of technology seemed comparable, and the magic used here could also be found in his own world. Around them, the entire way station unfolded like a small city built in the shadow of a gigantic wall. Magical lanterns stood everywhere, unlike any he had seen before. Instead of glowing crystals, they contained round orbs that floated inside glass enclosures mounted on poles. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the lanterns illuminated the area with a bright, steady light. Massive stables stood to the left, their doors wide enough for drake horses to pass through without lowering their heads. On the right were rows of workshops where not only weapons and armor were being repaired, but carts damaged during travel as well. Rusty spotted large claw marks on a wagon in the distance, and the sight made him eager for the day they would finally venture outside. The shops also seemed more focused on resupplying travelers than selling specialty goods. This was a supply station rather than a true merchant hub, but the academy apparently had little need for its services. Their vehicle remained on the road while waiting in line, and the students were instead guided toward their temporary accommodation, a massive 5-story building. I've never seen an inn like this. This isn't an inn, Rusty. It's called a hotel, and it's been reserved for us. Gwen's explanation made Estrella grin once again. All thanks to being Class B1. We get the whole place to ourselves with no limits. She puffed out her chest proudly, but her grin quickly faded when Saber walked past. Just try not to overeat. You've been getting larger lately. Estrella froze and glanced down at her stomach. To Rusty, she did not look particularly large, but she clearly disagreed. Her expression turned offended almost instantly. Hey, what did you mean by that? Stop right there, you idiot. The chase began immediately. The teacher did not seem particularly concerned by the commotion. They passed through the entrance while attendants standing by the doors bowed as they entered. For Rusty, who had grown up in a frontier town bordering a large orc tribe and had spent much of his new life in the slums, such treatment was entirely unfamiliar. He was not sure whether the deference was due to the presence of noble children or because promising summoners carried greater status. Regardless, they were escorted inside and led first to a large dining hall where the students were free to eat as much as they wanted. The dining hall was not as large as the academy cafeteria, but it could easily accommodate more than twice the number of people currently present. Rusty, being a living suit of armor, could not really judge the quality of the food, but it still looked strange to him. The idea of consuming other creatures to sustain one's body seemed highly inefficient. Within the confines of the hotel, the restrictions placed on summoned creatures still remained. However, the effect felt less oppressive than before. Rusty suspected this was because the suppression originated from enchanted equipment carried by the teaching staff rather than from the hotel itself, making its influence noticeably weaker. After that, it was time for the humanoids to clean themselves, something he was not used to seeing either. Where he came from, water was rarely available and was mainly reserved for cooking and drinking. Using it for bathing was usually a luxury enjoyed only by wealthy merchants and nobles. He had heard that humanoids developed an unpleasant smell if they went too long without washing, but lacking a nose himself, it was never something that concerned him. Don't you even dare try to peek. Why would anyone want to do that? You've been warned. The girls gathered on one side while the boys took the other. For some reason, Rusty was brought along for the wash as well. The bathhouse was surprisingly spacious, with polished white floors made from what looked like expensive stone. He was able to move around without anyone's help. Many other tiny summoned creatures scurried about the room. He spotted a small turtle spinning through the air, while Arania's tiny spider was chasing Estrella's fairies. The scene looked peaceful, but all the water being used seemed terribly wasteful. A large basin held heated water, and more flowed continuously from stone monster heads mounted along the walls. There were even decorative engravings made from precious metals in several places, which struck him as an absurd waste of resources. If only I could take some of this with me. I wouldn't even need to sell monster parts. He spotted traces of rare metals and gold throughout the room. They served no purpose beyond decoration, something he had never understood about humanoids. He would have been perfectly content living in a damp cave in the middle of nowhere as long as he had monsters to fight and gleam by his side. Yet these humanoids surrounded themselves with luxury while treating it as ordinary. Well, once this is over, maybe something exciting will finally happen. He thought to himself as he carefully moved across the slippery floor, his small halberd in hand. Suddenly, he glanced to the side and noticed something strange. A small panel had slid open, and he could see movement on the other side. An attacker. Gah! Without a second thought, he lunged forward and thrust his weapon through the opening. The moment he did, a shout rang out. The voice was immediately familiar. It belonged to one of the boys who often hung around Arania. Hey, what's wrong with his eye? It wasn't like that before. You know how boys are. They probably got into a fight or something. Rusty rested in Gwen's arms while looking at the youth called Eldrick. One of his eyes was covered by an eye patch that radiated healing energy. Not long ago, it had been poked by Rusty's halberd when he caught the young man trying to peek into the girls' washroom. To Rusty, the whole situation made no sense. Was he trying to gather information about the weaknesses of the other summoners? Could he be some sort of spy? There was no Alexander here to explain the situation, but Rusty did not think the young man was an adversary, so there had to be another reason. Fortunately for Eldrick, Rusty's weapon was not particularly sharp in its smaller form, allowing him to keep his eye intact. It had only swollen slightly, and the eye patch would help it heal more quickly. Several other boys gathered around him while glancing toward the girls, who were already dressed. There was a strange atmosphere among them, and Rusty was certain that more people had been involved in the incident. Just leave them be. They're probably being stupid as always. Estrella commented while looking at the group of young men. Rusty turned toward the only person he really knew, Sibber. When the young man's cat-like eyes met his own, Rusty saw him grinning and giving a small nod, as if thanking him for something. Rusty nodded back without truly understanding the gesture. Let's go to sleep. I'm starting to get tired. Gwen spoke with a yawn she tried and failed to hide. The long journey, the games, and the excitement of finally reaching the wall had clearly drained her energy. Even Estrella, who normally seemed capable of running endlessly, looked less energetic than usual. Agreed. Arania replied softly from behind her fan, and then they parted ways. Since the hotel had been rented out for the entire school, everyone received their own room. Gwen carried Rusty to a private room near the end of the third floor. The room was about the same size as the dorm room she shared with the other girls, though it was designed for a single person. It contained most of the things humanoids seemed to want: a window overlooking the city, a large bed that had already been made with soft cushions, and even a desk stocked with books to read. Wow! Although Gwen was a noble, she came from a house that had lost most of its wealth, something Rusty already knew. He was not sure what her life had been like before attending the academy, but it was clear that she was not accustomed to this level of luxury. This is nicer than my room at home. I wish I could show this to Grandma and my parents. Rusty looked around the room as Gwen set him down, allowing him to jump from her arms. Others might have asked about the history of her noble house and how it had fallen into decline, but Rusty had more important concerns. He was worried about intruders. He could feel the restrictions on his body beginning to weaken, which meant he needed to stay alert for any summoned creatures that might try to invade. Don't worry, Gwen. I'll guard you through the night, so just go to sleep and rest. Haha, I can always count on you, Rusty. She replied with a smile, then whispered a few words, thinking he could not hear her. If only you could stay with me forever. He did not respond. He knew that was not really possible due to how his summoning system worked. Perhaps in the future, once he gathered enough coins, he could unlock something that would create a direct link between them. Maybe there would even be a way for him to enter this place not as a summon, but as a true monster. Until then, he would simply do what he always did, protect her and fulfill his mission. Rusty marched toward the windowsill and climbed onto it with some effort. The glass overlooked the way station below, where hundreds of lanterns illuminated the streets like stars. Travelers still moved between the buildings despite the late hour. Wagons rolled through the streets, merchants shouted their final offers, and armored adventurers wandered between taverns and inns. The place looked busy, but it was also heavily guarded. Magical creatures accompanied many of the patrols, making it a well-defended location. However, it was also the sort of place where enemies could slip in unnoticed, so he remained vigilant. His watch began as soon as Gwen closed her eyes. It did not take her long to fall asleep, and Rusty knew waking her would be difficult as she was a heavy sleeper. Time passed, reminding him of the silent and uneventful nights he had spent in the dormitory, where nothing ever happened. Just as this night seemed destined to be no different, something finally caught his attention. There was no sound outside, but he noticed shadows moving through the well-lit corridor. Silencing magic again. He immediately turned his attention to the door. It was made of reinforced wood and looked quite sturdy. Breaking it down would not be easy, but it did have one weakness. A large gap ran along the bottom, wide enough for small creatures to squeeze through. A moment later, he saw something slithering underneath it. A snake. He raised his halberd and moved forward. In his current form, he was rather small. Even an ordinary snake would seem like a giant serpent to him. There was no indication of why this creature was here, but he could tell one thing immediately. It was not a normal living snake. It was a summon. How did this thing get in here? Is it a weakened summon like me? No, it doesn't look like it. Creatures affected by the summon creature reduction skill always looked different. Their features appeared less threatening and somehow softer, as though the summoning magic intentionally made them seem harmless. This snake possessed none of those traits. Fortunately, it looked weak, not even qualifying as a proper F-rank creature. Did someone summon a weak creature to harm Gwen because the professor is restricting summoning magic? That was Rusty's best guess. The monster before him was rather feeble. At full strength, he could have crushed it beneath his boot. If it tried to bite his metal body, it would probably break its fangs. However, in his current weakened state and with the weapon he carried, dealing with it would not be as easy. Gwen, wake up! There's a snake in here. MMMM. He called out to his summoner, but she was fast asleep. Unless he splashed water on her face, she probably would not wake up. Thus, it was up to him to protect her from this unexpected danger. Hey, ugly, come here. I'll be your opponent. In this form, he was rather weak, and his body was malformed. His limbs were shorter, his head unnecessarily large, and the shield and halberd he carried were the size of a tea saucer and a wooden fork. Yet this would have to do. As he smacked his halberd against the small shield, it produced a loud enough sound to keep the snake's eyes fixed on him. SSSSS. The snake lowered its head and coiled itself tightly. Its eyes reflected the light seeping beneath the door. It waited for a chance to pounce as it slowly moved forward. He had fought creatures like this before and had read about them in the bestiary housed within his Soul Forge library. Some reptilian species reacted to movement, others to body heat or sound, and some responded to all three. When it first entered the room, it had moved toward Gwen, perhaps reacting to her body heat or breathing. The snake finally struck. It launched itself from the floor with surprising speed, its body blurring as it shot toward Rusty. Too slow. To Rusty, who had seen the mercenary leader Varkas use dash step, this was nothing. Or at least it should have been. Unfortunately, his body was quite difficult to move. Even though he could see the entire lunge and predict where it was heading, he could not react properly. Damn! Barely, he managed to raise his tiny shield in time. The impact sent him sliding backward due to his light weight and inability to use his weight increase skill. The snake's jaws closed around the entire shield, exposing its fangs. A strange purplish liquid dripped from them, and when it touched the metal, it sizzled slightly. If this thing bites Gwen! Instantly, he knew the snake was dangerous. It was not particularly strong, but its venom was potent. Whoever had let it inside was surely counting on it biting Gwen while she slept, something he could not allow to happen. If she died, his mission would be over. Stupid snake! Even in this form, I can still fight. Rusty shouted as he swung his tiny arm forward. His halberd struck the creature on the nose, but instead of drawing blood, it only scraped a few scales. Blasted dull weapon! To his dismay, his current weapon had become so blunt that it would struggle to cut through a loaf of bread, let alone the scales of a living creature. The snake hissed and pulled back, clearly annoyed and ready to strike again. Don't look down on me! Rusty charged forward instead. Rather than aiming for the creature's body, he targeted its eyes. His weapon had managed to injure a much larger humanoid before, so the same should be possible here. The serpent immediately recoiled, twisting its head away. It was a simple reaction, but it confirmed his suspicion. HSSS. You're not getting away. Give me your other eye. Rusty chased after the snake, his large helmet wobbling awkwardly on his body. The monster refused to give up. It charged forward and latched onto his metal head, which popped off almost instantly. As it tried to bite down on the helmet, he seized the opportunity and drove his halberd into its other eye, drawing blood this time. The snake started thrashing wildly. It did not know that he could still move his body even when his head had been knocked from his shoulders. A living armor's weakness was its core, which was located on the inside of his helmet. Die! He shouted as he tried to push his weapon deeper into the creature's eye socket, but his enemy would not go down so easily. It whipped its body around in a strange motion, knocking him away. He stumbled backward and slammed into the edge of a nearby desk. One of his hands popped right off from the impact. SSSSSS. The snake's eye was bleeding, but it still had the other one. It charged again, though not at him. Instead, it lunged at the detached hand lying on the floor and swallowed it whole. What are you doing, you stupid snake? Give me back my arm! The snake paid him no attention as it gulped down the small metallic appendage. However, as soon as it turned back toward him, it began acting strangely. Something was wrong. It started writhing and twisting, its mouth opening and closing as if it were about to vomit. Ha, you didn't know that I could still control my limbs separately even in this form. Rusty shouted as he charged forward and slammed his shield into the snake's head. The hand it had swallowed was moving around inside its body, clawing and scraping as it tried to force its way back out. No, Astrella, don't eat that. As Gwen shifted in her bed, the floor beside it had become a battlefield. The monster was choking on Rusty's arm while being battered by the rest of him. The blood flowing from its wounds was already beginning to dissolve into mana particles. Just a little more. He was pushed back, bitten, and coiled around, but he refused to give up. His remaining hand smashed into the monster's chin while the one trapped inside continued causing it pain. Eventually, the detached arm blocked its throat completely. Even though the creature was only a summon, it still needed air to breathe, a weakness shared by almost all living beings. The thrashing continued. The monster's tail slammed into the desk again and again until several books tumbled free. They crashed down onto both Rusty and the snake. However, it turned out to be the lucky break he needed. One of the falling books struck his halberd and drove it deeper into the creature's eye socket, finishing it off. Ha! I did it, but... Finally, it was over. The monster's body dissolved into wisps of light and began disintegrating before him. Yet, to his dismay, he now found himself trapped beneath a pile of books. Both of his feet had fallen off, along with his remaining arm, and were scattered some distance away. They have fallen too far away. I can't pull them back. While the arm inside the snake could still move, his other limbs had fallen too far away for him to retrieve them. He was now stuck in this place, and Gwen was still sleeping soundly. For a while, he worried that more snakes would appear, but even after nearly half an hour had passed, nothing happened. Did the perpetrator run away, or is he among the students? There were many students in B1, including one in particular who used higher-level snake summons. However, this specific monster was something any of them could have conjured. It was also a venomous creature with low battle power, perfect for an assassination attempt. If Gwen had been bitten, he had no way of knowing whether she would have survived. Who could it have been? I must find out. He strained his mind, trying to figure out who could have done this. Arania and the two youths were possibilities, but only because he knew so little about them. From what he had seen, none of them seemed malicious enough to attempt poisoning another student, although the way they had been looking at the girls in the washing room made them suspicious. Astrella and Sibir were completely trustworthy, leaving him with little clue as to who the perpetrator might be. Could it be a ploy by Catherine Grandwell or that Bartholomew Woodward? Neither of them seems to like Gwen, and they both lost duels to me. They were both potential suspects. Each was considered among the best in their respective class and could have held a grudge against Gwen. However, just as he had been summoned a second time, another student might have acted in hopes of currying favor with powerful nobles or influential figures. This might be a more treacherous trip than I thought. Gwen continued to mumble in her sleep while he remained buried beneath the heavy tomes. He had expected the wagon to be attacked by monsters at most, not for his summoner to become the target of an assassination plot. Now he had to watch for both threats. I don't like the schemes of humanoids, just let me fight regular monsters. He tried calling back one of his arms, but it remained trapped beneath the weight of the books. It seemed he would need Gwen's help to get out of this predicament. Gwen, wake up! Gwen, if you don't, the teacher will be mad. A loud knocking sound echoed against the door from the outside. It was followed by the voice of her best friend, Astrella. Some of the students were already awake, getting dressed and ready to continue the journey. Wake up, it's breakfast. We'll be getting some delicious peach cake too. If you don't wake up, they'll eat it all. The knocking continued, but it was only when the tasty treat was mentioned that Gwen's eyes finally began to open. Peach cake. Gwen sat upright so suddenly that her blanket flew halfway off the bed. Where? She blinked a few times before realizing she was still in the hotel room and that the knocking was coming from outside. Oh right. We were on a trip. As she yawned and rubbed her eyes, she heard her summons voice. Gwen. Rusty. Gwen looked around in confusion because she couldn't see him. Where are you? I'm over here, under the books. Finally, she glanced down from her bed and saw the aftermath of the battle she had missed the previous night. Gwen stared at the room in utter confusion. Books were scattered across the floor. Several had fallen open, their pages bent and crumpled. A pen had rolled off the desk. Rusty's scattered limbs lay among a collection of other items he had knocked over during the night. In the middle of the disaster, Rusty sat trapped beneath a pile of books, one arm sticking out and waving in Gwen's direction. Gwen stared while Rusty waved his only attached arm, the one that had previously been inside the snake's body. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke before he finally broke the silence. Could you help me, Gwen? I can't move. Ah, of course. How did this happen? Gwen finally climbed out of bed and began removing the books from his body. Even for her, some of the tomes were difficult to lift. At last, Rusty was freed from the prison he had spent hours trapped inside. Fortunately, no other creature had wandered into his summoner's room while he was incapacitated. Oh, I just slipped and fell over. Rusty decided to lie about what had happened the previous night because he wasn't sure who the perpetrator was. His humanoid summoner was a rather peculiar individual. He knew that if he told her the truth, she would do nothing but worry. Almost anyone could have been responsible, including the teacher, who could not be trusted. Gwen would probably report the incident immediately, which could be either a good thing or a bad thing. In his mind, if the perpetrator realized how the snake had been defeated, they might improve their next attempt. If no one reacted to the incident at all, perhaps they would assume that some sort of protective measure from the hotel had stopped them, or that they had simply been unlucky. If they learned that Rusty had been responsible, they might try to eliminate him in some way. Keeping his cards hidden seemed like the better choice. He wasn't certain this was the best course of action, but for now, he decided to observe the situation and avoid stressing his summoner unnecessarily. If she started looking over her shoulder at every little thing, she would become too distracted to focus properly, leaving herself vulnerable to an attack. He also wanted her to enjoy the trip to some extent and was confident that he could handle whatever was thrown at him. Gwen crouched down and picked up one of his detached legs. You slipped so badly that your legs fell off. Yes. And your arm too. Also, yes. She raised an eyebrow. And somehow your helmet has bite marks on it. Rusty froze for a moment as he remembered the snake biting him several times. Even if it had been a creature made of mana and no poison remained, the damage to his miniaturized body was still there. I was just very unlucky. Maybe that pen hit me, or one of the tome's edges. Gwen narrowed her eyes. One of the fallen books had a sharp corner, so it sounded plausible. Some people might have been suspicious of his explanation, but they were not his summoner. She had no reason to doubt his word, so after gathering his limbs and helping him heal with her mana, she let out a sigh. Just be careful from now on, Rusty. I don't know what I would do if something happened to you and you were unsummoned. Gwen carefully reattached his legs one by one while feeding mana into the damaged joints. Tiny streams of blue light flowed from her fingertips, knitting together the cracks in his metal body. Back in the dungeon, he had fought creatures many times his size. He had stood against monsters, bandits, and even trained warriors. Yet now he was sitting on a wooden floor while a sleepy girl repaired him like a broken toy after a fight with an ordinary snake. I know. I'll be careful. She knew that if his body was destroyed and he was unsummoned, he would not be able to return to her the way a normal summoned monster could. Although he had never told her about the summoning chamber directly, she understood that he was a special creature who required unusual conditions to be called forth. There, that should do it. Rusty jumped to his feet and tested his movements. Everything seemed to be working again. However, as he checked his flexibility, loud knocks echoed from the door. Gwen, are you in there? If you don't answer, I'll go get a teacher to break this door down. Ah. I'm fine, Astrella. I'll be out in a moment. Give me 5 minutes. Gwen scrambled to her feet, hurriedly getting dressed and splashing water on her face at the sink in her room. You've got 3 minutes, Gwen. The knocking continued as Gwen rushed around the room. Rusty stood there watching her dart from one side to the other, occasionally tripping over her own feet and nearly falling. Somehow, she managed to get into her school uniform within the time, though her hair was still a mess. Let's go, Gwen. I'm coming. Even though she did not feel ready, the constant knocking had become impossible to ignore. Her hair was uneven, with one side still flattened from sleep, but there was no time to worry about it. The knocking grew louder with every passing second. Finally, she opened the door, and Estrella burst inside, practically bouncing on her heels. "Gwen! Hurry up! They're already cutting the peach cake." Gwen did not even have the opportunity to respond before she was dragged out of the room. Rusty was pulled along as well, though his attention was elsewhere. He began scanning the people around them for the potential culprit. Based on his assessment, only one person had committed the crime, which narrowed the possibilities somewhat. Still, there were plenty of suspects. The students on this floor were all potential culprits, with the exception of Urania, whose room was on the upper floor alongside the teachers. Half of the students stayed on Gwen's floor, while the rest occupied the second floor. Only teachers were allowed to move through the corridors at night, but there were many spells capable of concealing movement. There was someone outside the door. They placed the snake directly through the gap in the door, and then left. The most obvious suspect was Eldrick, who specialized in serpentine creatures. For him, it would be a simple matter to send something small through the corridors without drawing attention. There had also been the incident at the baths involving his group, placing him high on the list of suspects. Yet while Rusty was suspicious of him, he could not think of a good reason for Eldrick to do it. Urania was another possibility. Perhaps she feared that Gwen, now supported by Rusty, might threaten her position. After all, Rusty was stronger than the spider. Lost in thought, Rusty continued observing the humanoids around him. Estrella hurried everyone into the dining room, where the cake remained untouched. He was familiar with humanoid habits. Sweat often indicated stress, and changes in a person's voice could reveal nervousness or guilt. However, as the morning went on, he found no one acting out of character. Eventually, Eldrick, and Urania appeared. None of them seemed surprised to see that Gwen was well. The students Rusty did not know showed little reaction either, which in his mind was almost more suspicious than surprise itself. However, he was not familiar enough with them to draw any conclusions, so for the moment, he had no suspect he could confidently accuse. "Rusty, why are you so quiet? Is something bothering you?" Estrella spoke through a mouthful of cake. "Probably your way of eating and talking with a full mouth." Sibber was with them as well, grinning as he watched Estrella stuff her face with sweet treats. Her face immediately turned red, not from embarrassment but from anger. Before a commotion could break out, however, a teacher arrived. "Everyone, you have 15 minutes to finish up. Then we are leaving." The students were shocked. The announcement instantly transformed the atmosphere in the dining hall. Only moments earlier, they had been leisurely enjoying breakfast. Now they were cramming food into their mouths while trying not to choke. 15 minutes. That's not enough time. Their complaints earned little sympathy from the teachers. Professor Quinton folded his arms and frowned. "You were informed yesterday that departure would be shortly after breakfast. Next time, go to sleep earlier and wake up on time. When you are finished, assemble outside. If you are late, it will reflect on your grades." Several students groaned. While this looked like a simple trip, it was also an active test. They were traveling to the Rose Knight Academy to participate in joint exercises with the Knights. If they performed particularly poorly, they could even be demoted to C class, something none of them wanted. Rusty and his group managed to arrive early thanks to Estrella, who could not resist gloating about it. Even so, they were not the first to arrive. Urania had already been waiting there from the beginning. Her two followers, however, were in a panic. Having barely eaten anything, they were hurriedly shoveling down baked potatoes and chunks of meat as Rusty's group headed outside. The moment they stepped out, the atmosphere shifted. The vehicle they had arrived in was gone, though that was expected. It had continued along the main road toward the city exit. Before long, the students gathered at the hotel entrance, where the teacher conducted a head count. Perched on Gwen's shoulder, Rusty watched the group carefully, but he still could not spot any suspicious behavior. "Maybe I'm not as good at analyzing these humanoids as I thought." For a moment, he wished a Burden were here, as he was quite good at it. He could notice subtle changes in speech patterns and even the slightest movements of the eyes. It was apparently not a skill, but rather experience gained from interrogating people and living as the Demon King, a ruler who constantly needed to know who was about to betray him. In the end, he had still been betrayed, but that was more due to the flaw in his belief that fear alone could maintain loyalty than any failure in his ability to identify potential traitors. "Everyone is gathered, so let us go." Remember, we will be traveling beyond the Great Defensive Wall. While we will be following a safe route and a group of adventurers will be protecting us, stay vigilant." The teacher paused for a moment, then stepped forward. Everyone followed. As they moved through the streets, Rusty saw more people joining the line while vendors interacted with passers-by. Beyond the wall, the dangers become very real. Most monsters avoid the roads because soldiers patrol them regularly, but accidents happen. If I give an order, you will follow it immediately. Is that understood? Yes, Professor. The students replied in unison. Good. Rusty was not quite sure how powerful the teacher was, but the amount of mana he possessed was immense. He was probably above D rank, somewhere within C rank or perhaps even B rank. However, Rusty could not rely on the teacher's strength if something happened. He would need to protect his summoner himself. The group continued onward, remaining silent due to the teacher's presence. Eventually, they arrived at the large wagon-like vehicle. The drake horses were already huffing and puffing smoke from their nostrils. There was one noticeable change since Rusty had last seen them. They now wore armor that covered much of their bodies, clearly intended to protect them from ranged attacks and magic. Please board according to your previously established seating order, and do not rush. The students began moving toward the wagon in a loose line. Rusty's group boarded after Sibir and Arania, making their way to the rear seats that no one else seemed interested in. The pecking order within the class had already been established, so nobody felt the need to compete for better seats at this point. It took around 20 minutes for everyone to settle in and for all the luggage to be loaded into the compartments. Isn't this exciting? We're going beyond the wall and back into the wide open world. Astrella seated herself by the window and looked outside. As the wagon began to move, she lightly shook Gwen's shoulder. They were now directly beneath the gigantic wall, yet everything remained brightly lit. The lanterns and lights they had previously seen from a distance were everywhere, even during the day. Why do they keep it so well lit? Rusty asked while peering through the window. It's to stop anything from trying to cross it. Some monsters can hide in the shadows, too. Gwen settled back into her seat after answering. I see. So it is to keep dangerous things from slipping inside and disturbing the peace. This world did not seem as dangerous as the one he had come from, but perhaps that was because of the sheltered environment surrounding the Magic Academy. With this level of security, it would be difficult for anything to enter unnoticed. Rusty continued watching through the window as the wagon rolled forward. The massive wall grew closer with every passing moment, its surface stretching so high that he could no longer see the morning sky. Guards stood everywhere, manning the towers and watching over the enormous metal gate ahead. So this is it. Gwen spoke quietly, and Rusty could hear her heart beating faster. The other students felt much the same, but it was not fear. They were simply excited to finally leave the Magical Academy after spending a full year there studying. The curriculum had been demanding, and students were rarely allowed beyond the academy grounds. Now, at last, they would be stepping into the wider world. The gate crept open, its massive metal plates grinding against each other. Surprisingly, the movement produced none of the deafening noise that such an enormous structure should have made. Sunlight spilled through the widening gap, and the moment to move on had finally arrived. Yet within his metallic core, Rusty remained uneasy. Someone had already made an attempt on Gwen's life, and he could not dismiss the possibility of another attack. Everyone was still a suspect, and he could not be certain that no one beyond the academy harbored ulterior motives against his summoner as well. The instant the wagon passed through the gate, the world changed. The waypoint vanished behind them, replaced by what could best be described as a military camp. As the gates closed and the massive wall disappeared from view, a series of smaller fortifications came into sight. They stood in a half-oval formation around the entrance, with overlapping layers of defenses designed to ensure that no enemy could even reach the main gate. It reminded Rusty of the outpost city he had once protected. Most of the people here wore some form of armor. Soldiers marched between barracks while adventurers moved in small groups, carrying weapons stained from recent use. Supply wagons rolled through the compound loaded with crates, arrows, and preserved food. Unlike the area they had come from, nobody here appeared relaxed. That looks like an adventurer guild, similar to the ones I've seen before. Even though this world was different from his own, some things remained the same. Adventurer guilds existed here as well, and some of these people would be accompanying them. Their wagon continued forward before eventually stopping beside a group of adventurers. The teacher stepped outside to speak with them. I can't hear what they are saying. Estrella leaned back in her seat with her hands behind her head. What could they be saying, Rusty? They're just confirming the details of the job. Once we reach Rose Knight Academy, they'll be handsomely rewarded. I see. It made sense. They were hired help, there to protect them from harm. The adventurers had their own mounts, creatures that resembled large wolves. There were 10 of them in total, and they soon took positions around the wagon as it resumed its journey through the camp. Many people glanced their way. Some looked interested, while others appeared dejected for reasons Rusty could not understand. Yet no one dared approach their wagon. He was not entirely sure why, but if this place resembled the one he came from, it was probably related to noble status. Most commoners feared nobles. Even minor nobles possessed influence, connections, and the power to make life difficult for anyone who crossed them. Rusty remembered hearing stories of entire villages suffering because a noble had taken offense at some imagined slight. The convoy continued onward. Before long, the last of the fortifications disappeared behind them. For the first time since arriving in this world, Rusty found himself looking at a truly open landscape. The tightly controlled academy grounds were gone, along with most of the restrictions. Only the spell within the wagon still forced him to remain in his smaller form. They really don't trust these young summoners with their power. He could hardly blame the older mages for placing restrictions on them. If even one summoner allowed their monster to grow inside such a confined space, chaos could follow. Some summons were enormous, others notoriously difficult to control. Many summoners focused solely on obtaining stronger creatures, each one requiring higher attributes and greater control than the last. The well-kept fields were gone, replaced by rough terrain untouched by generations of farmers. Tall grass swayed in the wind. Clusters of trees dotted the landscape at irregular intervals, while distant hills rose along the horizon. This was no longer cultivated land but a fully expanded area teeming with living creatures. I can see movement. Rusty immediately realized that non-humanoid monsters were hiding in the tall grass and among the trees. Some resembled serpentine birds, peeking their long necks out as the wagon rolled past. The road they traveled on was in good condition, and he noticed lights placed along its edges that seemed to keep the creatures at bay. What are those? Those are protective lights. They should be able to keep the weaker monsters from attacking. Only the weaker ones? He asked Gwen, prompting her to elaborate. Yes. If any strong monsters appear, we might be in trouble. But that will probably not happen, so let us just enjoy the trip instead. Gwen was in high spirits, but Rusty was not nearly as relaxed. He knew this was a mission chosen by the Soul Forge. Under normal circumstances, there was probably little chance of anything happening, but with him involved, those odds seemed to increase exponentially. For the time being, the journey continued uneventfully. Sibber, despite having rested at the hotel, fell asleep almost as soon as they started moving. The girls returned to their game, and while Estrella did not improve much, Gwen finally began expanding her strategy and playing more proactively. On the second night, they arrived at their first stop. It was another walled checkpoint, complete with large towers, ballista-like weapons, and protective lights scattered throughout the area. It seemed that the people of this world relied heavily on strong fortifications and magical wards to keep monsters at bay. The hotel they stayed in was more modest this time, and the students had far fewer comforts than before. The boys and girls were divided into separate groups and slept together in larger shared rooms. While some of them complained, Rusty considered it a much safer arrangement. There were no secluded rooms where someone could easily release a venomous creature to target his unsuspecting summoner. He remained vigilant, keeping watch over the area and staying ready to act or make enough noise to wake everyone if necessary. Yet no one made a move that night. Either they had given up, or there were simply too many people gathered in one place to attempt a stealthy attack. The adventurers rode their wolven mounts alongside the wagon, maintaining a steady formation as it continued down the road. Their vigilance, however, left much to be desired. No one seemed to expect any sort of attack. Rusty could not entirely blame them, as the journey had been remarkably uneventful. And so it remained for more than half the trip, until everything changed. I could go for some strawberry cheesecake right now. Estrella grumbled, looking exhausted. They were now on the 5th day of their journey, and the youths had finally grown tired of their board game. What seemed destined to become another dull day of travel suddenly took a different turn. The teacher, he noticed something. While the children were distracted by their own activities, Rusty noticed a change in Quentin's behavior. The teacher was examining something through his monocle, which appeared to be an enchanted item of some sort. Rusty could tell that Quentin's attention was fixed in a single direction, and whatever he was observing seemed to be drawing more and more of his focus. Is something coming? Rusty said as he moved toward the window, trying to catch sight of whatever had drawn attention outside. Something is coming? Gwen asked with a yawn. The day was drawing to a close as they traveled through the rocky terrain of a mountain range they needed to cross. Their next destination was a waypoint embedded within the mountains themselves, but before they could reach it, they had to navigate the final stretch of winding roads that climbed higher into the peaks. To the left of the wagon was a steep drop with no protective railing to keep them from plunging over the edge. Professor Quentin rose from his seat and moved toward the rear of the wagon. His expression had become noticeably more serious. The adventurers riding alongside them seemed to notice it as well. Several straightened in their saddles and repositioned themselves along the rear side of the wagon as though preparing to defend it. Isn't it shaking more than usual? Estrella was the first to notice. Even through the dampening magic that normally smoothed out the wagon's movements, they could feel a faint tremor running through the vehicle. Then they saw it. A massive dust cloud was racing toward them from behind. Within it moved strange creatures. The beasts burst from the dust cloud like an avalanche. At first glance, they resembled oversized mountain goats, but only from a distance. Their bodies were covered in grey scales instead of fur, and sharp spiral horns curved backward from their skulls. Each creature was nearly as large as a horse. Their hooves struck the stone road with enough force to crack it, and their heads appeared skeletal, bathed in flames. Hell Ashrams! Get ready, students! Their teacher dispelled the silencing spell surrounding the wagon as the monsters rapidly closed the distance. Everyone who had been asleep jolted awake at the sound of his booming voice. The pounding of the drake horses' hooves grew louder as they accelerated, accompanied by the distant roars of the Hell Ashrams. Hell Ashrams? Why are we being chased by those creatures? Estrella pressed her face against the window, trying to get a better look, but she could barely see anything. Those monsters are attracted to mana. Were they drawn to us? Gwen mumbled as Rusty listened. How could that be? We're using concealment enchantments. No mana should be leaking through. Estrella countered, her voice growing increasingly nervous. I don't know. Rusty was almost certain he was the reason for this 1-in-1,000 predicament. Either the enchantment had failed, or this was another scenario created by the summoning chamber. Nevertheless, he needed to stay vigilant. I thought this was supposed to be a safe trip. If they reach us, they'll tear us apart. The other students began whispering among themselves, panic spreading as they listened to the strange sounds coming from outside. Before their fear could truly take hold, Quentin's voice rang out once more. Calm yourselves. This is exactly what you've been practicing for. The restrictions on your summons will now be lifted. Anyone with ranged capabilities, meet me on the roof. Quentin's tone was cold and resolute. The moment he finished speaking, Rusty felt the restrictions on his body vanish. He could now assume his full form, and so could all the other summoned creatures traveling within the wagon. That was not the only change. Moments later, part of the wagon's roof began to open. A set of stairs formed from the interior structure, allowing people to climb upward. Their teacher was the first to ascend, stepping onto the broad roof and taking position on the elevated platform from which he intended to protect the students. Some of the students were too scared to move. Others gritted their teeth and forced themselves toward the stairs as the wagon continued to shake from the impacts of their pursuers. Gwen, let's go. I can use my bow. With his restrictions removed, he could help as well, and he was eager to take part in the defense, which was probably part of the mission. Archery was not his strongest specialty, but he could still use a few skills and kill some of those goat-like monsters. Gwen did not answer immediately, but after clenching her fists, she finally nodded. Wait, Gwen. I'm coming with you. I'll give everyone some buffs. Estrella was willing to help as well, but many of their friends were not sure if they should join them. I'm more suited for close-range combat. Sibber frowned, knowing his bestial form would not be much help. Eldrick's snakes had no ranged capabilities, and Aldrich specialized in heavily defensive golems. Even Arania was at a disadvantage, as her massive spider would probably only get in the way. Only a handful of students headed for the stairs. The roof was fairly spacious since the wagon itself was large. Rusty remained in his smaller form while Gwen carried him upward, her hands shaking slightly. As soon as they emerged onto the roof, the wind whipped past them with such force that several students nearly lost their footing. Be careful and don't lose your balance. Quentin shouted as many of the students dropped to their knees the moment they arrived. A protective railing surrounded the roof to catch anyone who stumbled, but it was still a dangerous place to stand. The air around their teacher shifted as he began summoning something. Moments later, the creature revealed itself. Blue, icy energy condensed before them, and even Rusty's metallic body started to gather frost. A strange being composed of ice and swirling snowy energy emerged. It floated above the ground, supported by long, thin upper limbs and a triangular body that looked almost unnatural. It's the teacher's ice elemental. Those ashrams won't stand a chance. One of the students shouted as the creature fully materialized before them. Though large, it hovered directly overhead. Cold mist rolled from its body in slow waves, coating the wooden planks beneath them in a thin layer of frost. The temperature dropped so rapidly that several students began to shiver. Then it unleashed its full power. Massive spears of ice shot into the distance. Each was far thicker than an ordinary spear, and their destructive power was undeniable. They streaked through the air in graceful arcs like oversized arrows. Whenever one struck a monster, the result was immediate. The spear pierced straight through its target and froze half of its body solid. A storm of frozen projectiles filled the sky as more of the creatures were struck and immobilized. Yet the chase continued as though the horde had no end. After witnessing their teacher's overwhelming display of power, the students wanted to contribute as well. Rusty expanded into his normal form, drew his bow, and began firing. His arrows flew alongside the ice javelins. While they dealt far less damage, they still managed to pierce the monster's burning flesh. More students joined the fight as additional summons appeared. One was a gigantic plant that launched spikes from its strange, gaping mouth. Astrella provided support magic, strengthening everyone's abilities. Together, the relentless barrage of projectiles gradually forced the pursuing avalanche of ram-like monsters to retreat. We are doing it! I knew we were already top-notch summoners. Astrella cheered as everything was going great. Don't be careless. This isn't over yet. Quentin's voice rang out as he adjusted his monocle and looked ahead. Rusty turned with him and soon saw what had caught his attention, a strange black cloud approaching from the opposite direction, filled with countless glowing skulls. Hell bats! One of the students shouted as the mass ahead revealed itself to be a swarm of black bats with flaming skeletal faces. Without warning, they swooped toward them like a tidal wave, forcing their teacher to react. Ice Elemental, shield! He shouted, and his summon spun around, quickly conjuring a thick wall of ice encasing the front of the wagon. The bats slammed into it with tremendous force. The carriage shook violently, and the students lost their footing, crashing into the safety railing. That was when it happened. Rusty saw a series of vines lash out, shoving Gwen in the direction she was already stumbling. The push sent her over the railing. He reacted on instinct, lunging forward and vaulting over the side after her as they both plunged from the cliff together. No, Gwen! Astrella shouted as she watched her friend fly through the air. She tried to order one of her fairies to summon a gust of wind and pull Gwen back, but the roof of the wagon continued to shake and sway as the bats hurled themselves against the icy barrier. One of her fairies shot forward, its tiny wings beating furiously as it gathered wind mana. A swirling gust formed around its hands, but before it could release the spell, another collision rocked the wagon. Students tumbled across the roof, and Quentin slammed a hand against his own ice to keep himself upright. His ice elemental reinforced the barrier that encased the entire roof of the wagon. The wall of ice expanded just as Astrella tried to leap over the edge to save her friend. Instead, she was met with a sheet of ice striking her in the face. And no, Professor! Gwen fell off. We need to save her. The teacher's head snapped toward the direction his student had been thrown, but it was already too late. The speed of the carriage, combined with the chaos surrounding them, made any immediate rescue impossible. For a brief moment, Quentin's expression tightened. It was clear he was weighing his options, but the hesitation vanished almost instantly as he made his decision. Everyone, remain in position. His voice thundered across the roof and echoed through the wagon. We are still under attack. If this barrier falls, more students could be harmed. Astrella stared at him in disbelief. But Gwen! I know. We will return for her after we reach the waypoint. The teacher's words made sense, but Astrella still protested. By then, she could be hurt or worse, dead. Quentin, who usually maintained a neutral expression, frowned. And if I weaken our defenses now, all of you could join her. I cannot endanger all of you for one student. Another impact rattled the wagon. The icy shell covering the roof groaned as dozens of hell bats exploded against it in bursts of black flame. Estrella wanted to argue. She wanted to scream. But deep down, she knew he was right. The convoy could not stop. Not here. Not while they were surrounded on both sides. Hundreds of monsters were trying to tear them apart, and beyond the road waited a deadly plunge into the gorge below. Gwen, stay safe. Estrella could do nothing but stare into the distance where her friend had fallen. The sun had already disappeared beyond the horizon, and shadows were steadily swallowing the mountains. Still, she held on to hope. Someone had gone with Gwen. Someone who had always managed to pull her through even the most desperate situations. The world became a blur. Wind howled past Rusty's helmet as he plummeted through open air. Below him stretched a seemingly endless drop. Above, the wagon was already racing away along the mountain road. He caught a glimpse of the flaming rams continuing their charge, but quickly turned his attention to the more immediate problem of cushioning his summoner's fall. Rusty. Don't worry, I got you. His body expanded as he assumed his Goliath form. With his increased size, he wrapped one hand around his summoner and held her close against his shoulder. His other hand shot toward the mountainside. At first, his fingers scraped uselessly across the rock. Then, after adding more strength, his fingers sank in. Stone cracked beneath his grip as he drove his hand deep into the cliff face. The force of the fall pushed his arm back, but he held firm. Chunks of rock tore free and scattered into the abyss below as his hand carved a deep trench through the mountainside, steadily halting their momentum. The stone ground between his fingers. Rusty's metal hand carved a deep trench into the mountainside as sparks erupted around him. The force of their fall dragged him downward despite his efforts. Chunks of rock broke free and tumbled into the darkness below. His arm shook violently from the strain while Gwen clung to his shoulder. It was a difficult task. His summoner was rather delicate, and even though her physical stats had reached E rank, he did his utmost to reduce the vibrations. His body was made of hard metal and was not very good at dispersing shocks, causing clear discomfort to Gwen as they slid down into the chasm below. Try to bear the pain, Gwen. I think I see some trees. We're probably close to the bottom. I'm fine. Gwen closed her eyes and clung to his chest and arm as he tried to make the fall as gentle as possible. The darkness below began to thin as the ground came into view. At this point, Rusty could tell they were starting to slow down. The rocks continued to crumble as he drove his fingers deeper into the mountainside. Eventually, just as they came within a meter of the ground, they stopped. With a small hop, he lowered himself the rest of the way and quickly turned to Gwen to make sure she was all right. The silence after the descent felt heavier than the fall itself. For a moment, neither of them moved. The mountain air was cold and filled with strange, distant echoes. Among them, he could hear the chase continuing above. At the same time, unfamiliar sounds drifted from deep within the forest. So, this is the true start of this mission. Rusty had expected something like this, but he wished he had reacted faster and prevented Gwen's fall. He also wondered if things might have turned out differently had he been more honest and cautious. Maybe if he had told Gwen the truth and convinced her to remain in the wagon with Sibber and the other students, none of this would have happened. I'm sorry, Gwen. This is all my fault. Rusty finally decided to come clean about the situation and apologize for keeping what he had discovered a few days ago to himself. What are you talking about, Rusty? You saved my life. Yes, but this might never have happened if I had told you about the attack that night. The attack that night? She was clearly confused, having slept through the entire incident. At the time, he had not wanted to upset her. He believed he could find the culprit himself, but that decision had ultimately led to this disaster. Gwen stared at him for a moment, still catching her breath as the weight of everything that had happened slowly settled in. The cold mountain air clung to her skin, and she was clearly freezing, but Rusty had to get this off his chest. Yes. At the first way station, while you were sleeping, someone sent a venomous snake into your room. A venomous snake. She flinched at the mention of snakes and immediately connected the dots. So that's why your body was like that. Yes. I fought the snake off and ended up in that condition. He lowered his head in shame, finally realizing how badly he had handled the situation. He expected to be scolded, but Gwen was not that kind of person. Silly Rusty, you should have told me. I know I'm not always reliable, but... It seemed Gwen had taken it differently than he expected, blaming herself for not being trustworthy or worthy enough. I didn't mean it like that. I just thought I could take care of things myself along the way. If I had told you sooner, maybe it wouldn't have come to this. Rusty was truly ashamed of himself for dismissing his summoner. He had convinced himself that it was enough for him alone to know the truth and that he could handle whatever came his way without involving her. Don't blame yourself, Rusty. You meant well. Gwen immediately tried to cheer him up, which only made him feel even more foolish than before. Before they could continue the conversation, he heard a strange sound coming from somewhere nearby. What was that? I don't know, but it wasn't far away. Let's continue this once we're out of here. Gwen, do you know where the next waypoint is? This place was still dangerous. The strange monsters that had been pursuing them and the bats traveled in large groups, and some might still be roaming the cliffside forest they were trapped in. Their priority was getting through this area safely, and heading toward the waypoint, which was also a fortified stronghold, offered their best chance of survival. I actually do. Gwen nodded and pulled an item from her spatial bag, one of the few things that had survived the fall. From inside, she retrieved a magical device that Rusty immediately recognized. Is that a compass? It is, but it's a special one. Look. Rusty leaned closer as Gwen tilted the device in her palm. The compass was unlike any ordinary tool. Instead of a single needle, several thin luminous lines floated inside a glass casing, each shifting slightly as though reacting to unseen currents. It reacts to mana flow. Gwen explained, steadying her breathing. This one was designed for situations like this. See these mana lines? The purple one points to the nearest waypoint or major way station. The blue one points to Teacher Quinton. And the third one? The yellow one pointing in the other direction. That one points back to the academy. It's there to help us return if we ever get lost. Rusty nodded as he studied the magical compass. The purple and blue lines were pointing in nearly the same direction, clearly indicating where they needed to go. So we need to head this way, but that's pointing straight at the mountain. There was one problem. The compass only pointed in straight lines. There was no clear path from where they stood, and climbing up to rejoin the road, which was probably infested with ram monsters, seemed like a terrible idea. Don't worry, Rusty. I came prepared. Fortunately, he was not alone. Gwen reached into her bag again and pulled out a parchment. It was not particularly large, roughly the size of 2 book pages placed side by side. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than an old yellowed sheet of parchment. However, the moment she infused it with a small amount of mana, something began to change. Is it a map? Yes. A map of their surroundings slowly formed before his visor. Rusty was instantly fascinated by the item and wondered if he could recreate something similar in his soul forge. Normally, he relied on a burden's memories when it came to navigation, but if he could create something like this, it would be a game changer. The mountain range continued to reveal itself across the parchment. Thin glowing lines marked the roads that wound through the peaks, while clusters of symbols denoted forests, caves, and steep ravines. A faint point of purple light pulsed near the center of the map. There. This is where we are, and the waypoint we have to reach is here. Gwen pointed to their current location on the map. They needed to make their way through a large forested area. While climbing onto higher ground would be difficult, there seemed to be a path that would bring them closer to their destination. Perhaps if we make it here, the teacher will pick us up. Gwen mumbled to herself as she traced a finger across the map. Rusty was not entirely sure how things worked here, but his summoner was still a noble. The teacher would probably come looking for them and likely had a compass of his own to track any students who got lost along the way. That sounds plausible. You're really great, Gwen. Gwen blinked twice before immediately turning red. I am not. You are. I'm really not. You have a magical map, a magical compass, and now, thanks to that, we have a proper plan. Rusty began praising his summoner after his earlier blunder. He had come up with a plan of his own, but it had not worked out particularly well. His approach was simple. Even if things did not go his way, as long as he hit the problem hard enough, it would usually go away. That strategy often worked in his favor because, when it came to battle tactics, he was remarkably effective. Hee. Gwen chuckled, but after a moment, her body shivered as the cold air around them intensified. Now that we have a path, let's get moving. How about you guide us, Gwen, and I'll keep us safe. I'll do that, but I can do more than just guide us, Rusty. Gwen proclaimed before dropping to one knee. She pulled out something resembling a wand with several gems embedded at its tip. It began to glow as she chanted a summoning ritual. Within moments, several living armor constructs appeared around them, along with 2 flying imps. "This way, you won't have to worry about me getting attacked, Rusty," she said, and he nodded. Soon, the 2 of them began moving forward. The night air was cold, but Gwen's uniform carried an enchantment that kept her warm. It seemed the magical academy was well prepared for students getting lost. The path ahead wound between towering, spiky trees whose branches blocked most of the moonlight. Shadows stretched across the forest floor, broken only by the faint glow of Gwen's magical map and compass. Rusty walked at the front while the summoned armors spread out around them in a protective formation. The 2 imps fluttered overhead, their small eyes scanning the darkness. The area reminded him somewhat of the snowy Yeti peaks he had once visited with that necromancer. Fortunately, the snow had only accumulated atop the trees while the ground remained mostly clear. The colder weather had also hardened the earth beneath them, which worked in his favor since his metal boots no longer sank into soft terrain. Yet, while the trip started well, after around 5 minutes, they encountered their first obstacle. A ram with a flaming head stood before them, along with several others that had fortunately perished in a fall. "Be careful, Gwen. These monsters must have fallen during the chase. There could be more of them around here." For the time being, Rusty assumed his smaller form, as the larger one would have struggled to move between the densely packed trees. Before them stood a lone ashram, one of the monsters that had previously pursued their wagon. An entire stampede had chased them earlier, and the path ahead seemed littered with those that had tumbled down the mountainside. Some had fallen to their deaths, but many still remained alive, and Rusty could sense their life signatures through his skill. The creature before them was quite large. Its head resembled that of a skeletal ram, wreathed in flames, while its body was covered in grey scales, just as they had seen from atop the wagon. Up close, however, the creature looked far more imposing than it had from a distance. Nevertheless, there was no turning back now. Classification: Ashram D. Type: Beast/Demon. Description: Ashrams are demonic beasts said to originate from the lower hells. They resemble massive rams with skeletal heads wreathed in eternal flame and bodies covered in heat-resistant scales. Despite their size, ashrams are capable of explosive bursts of speed and often overwhelm prey through relentless charges. These creatures possess an unusual affinity for fire mana. Injuries that would cripple ordinary beasts can be partially mended by absorbing nearby flames, making them difficult opponents in prolonged battles. Ashrams are highly territorial and typically travel in herds led by stronger variants. When threatened, they become increasingly aggressive and may continue fighting even after sustaining mortal wounds. This seemed like an ordinary variant of the creature, but the description implied that a stronger one could be among the herd. Stronger variants, it won't be a C rank, right? If it had been any other time, he would have been excited to confront a C rank monster at his current level. He had already defeated the pinnacle of D rank in the form of the mercenary leader and was now stronger than before. However, Gwen was with him. If such a powerful foe appeared, her life would be at risk, and retreating might be their only option. Maybe I should make another armor variant once this is over. He had created 2 different types for his metallic frame. One was the Wraith, built for agility, and the other was the Goliath, designed for raw strength. However, there were many other forms he could take. He had previously been able to assume the shape of a centaur-like armor. While that form was not ideal for direct combat, it had potential when it came to traveling long distances as a mount. Bay. The ashram finally started moving. It sounded strangely similar to some mountain goats he had encountered during his travels, but the cry carried something far more sinister. Lowering its head, it shot forward and charged straight at them. "No, you won't." Rusty remained where he was and simply raised his shield in front of him. While the monster appeared to possess tremendous charging power, defense was his specialty. Even in his standard form, he could withstand incredible force by increasing his weight and lowering his center of gravity. A loud crash echoed through the forest. The ashram slammed into Rusty's shield with enough force to uproot nearby shrubs and send loose snow cascading from the branches above. Flames burst from the beast's skull as it pushed forward with everything it had. Rusty's metallic boots slid a few centimeters across the ground, but he barely moved. His shield remained undamaged, and the flames failed to penetrate his armor. The impact was powerful enough to make the arm holding the shield vibrate violently for a moment, but he suffered no damage. "A normal D-rank monster is no match for me," he shouted as he pushed back against the ram. Its head jerked backward, and it stumbled a few steps away after the collision. However, it refused to give up. Almost immediately, it charged again. This time, the impact was much weaker because it had not been able to build up enough speed. This creature, is it kind of dumb? Rusty watched in surprise as the monster repeatedly hurled itself at his shield in a straight line. It seemed incapable of doing anything except charging forward. If it's really like this, Gwen, why don't you order the others to attack while I keep it occupied? Gwen had been observing the battle alongside the other living armors. The moment Rusty turned his helmet toward her, she understood what he meant. Ah, of course, Rusty. Leave it to me. Gwen raised her wand and pointed it toward the demonic beast. Everyone, attack! The living armors immediately obeyed. Two rushed in from either side with swords raised, while another advanced with a spear. Above them, the imps unleashed small bolts of dark mana that streaked through the air and slammed into the monster. Baaaaaa! Just as Rusty had thought, the ashram continued to ignore them, as it seemed capable of moving only forward. He was not sure why, but it was an extremely easy weakness to exploit. There was one problem, though. Most of Gwen's summoned creatures were still E-rankers. They were close to reaching the pinnacle of that rank, but they had not crossed into the next one yet. Their weapons mostly bounced off the monster's scales, but with their relentless attacks, they eventually managed to pierce its hide. Ack! Gwen recoiled in shock as dark blood sprayed from both sides of the ashram. This was not a summoned monster but a real living creature made of demonic flesh. It could bleed like any other being, and it seemed that the young summoner was not quite used to sights like these. Rusty pushed forward, forcing the monster off balance, and delivered the final blow with his halberd. He struck directly into the wound created by the living armors. The weapon punched through the opening and deep into the creature's chest. Baaaaaa! The ashram staggered backward. Flames burst from its nostrils as it tried to rear up for another charge, but Rusty twisted the weapon and ripped it free. Dark blood sprayed across the snow, and the creature's legs finally buckled. Its massive body crashed onto its side and slid several meters through the frozen undergrowth before finally becoming still. Is it dead? It should be. Rusty responded while shaking his halberd to clear some of the blood from the blade. Gwen looked away. She did not like the sight. The monsters fought by summoners were usually other summoned beasts, and the creatures inside void gates dissolved into particles of light after being slain. This one, however, remained where it had fallen. Black blood continued to pool around its body, releasing a strong, unpleasant smell. Herb. Gwen, are you all right? What's wrong? It's nothing. Gwen covered her mouth and turned away from the corpse. Rusty immediately stepped between her and the dead beast. You don't have to look. I know, but the smell. Her voice was quiet. This was different from training. Different from the Academy's exercises, mock battles, and even the gates they entered. There were no protective magical spells woven into the environment, and nothing that would teleport them to safety if they were injured. One mistake could cost her life. Let's keep moving, Gwen. I'm not sure how many creatures like this one have made it down here, but the noise we made could have alerted them. Just as he finished speaking, he heard more strange noises in the distance. These monsters approached from predictable angles, but if enough of them arrived at once, they would have a serious problem. A single charge was easy to block, and once the creature could see nothing but his shield, it would continue moving straight ahead. However, if several of them attacked from different directions, Gwen would be in danger. Yes, that's a good idea. Let's keep moving. They resumed their journey and did not look back at the monster they had slain. Normally, Rusty would have loved to take the creature apart to see whether it contained any magical stones or if its flaming skulls could be used to craft something useful. At the moment, however, his priority was Gwen. He needed to get her back to the other summoners as quickly as possible. So, Gwen, I see that you've managed to improve your skills. As they walked, Rusty spoke through their connection so no one else could hear them. I did. I can even summon armor that is much stronger than these, but it costs a lot of mana. You can? That's great. It was only natural that his summoner had improved. People like Sibir and Arania had already reached the middle of D rank. The same could be said for Eldrick and Aldric. Because of that, it was not surprising that Gwen had achieved this feat as well. Her mana capacity had reached D rank, and she had even managed to remain in B class despite Rusty being absent for half a year. Are there any other creatures you can summon besides those imps and living armors? I I can summon some other creatures, but they are lower ranked. Why? Oh, well, is there anything you can use as a mount? Not really. Gwen suddenly stopped as she noticed a series of glowing ram heads peeking through the trees in the distance. There are so many. Rusty jumped back as he spotted monsters approaching from both behind and ahead of them. Without hesitation, he grabbed Gwen, hoisted her over his shoulder, and started running. We need to run, Gwen. Distract them with the other armors. Gwen barely had time to let out a surprised squeak before Rusty took off. The forest blurred around them as his metal legs pounded against the frozen earth. Snow exploded beneath his boots with every step while the glowing skulls of the ashrams multiplied between the trees. I can hear hooves. They're really chasing us, and their numbers are. While Rusty was not one to run from a good fight, there were simply too many enemies. To make matters worse, these creatures were much faster once they began a chase. The only reason they had managed to avoid them so far was that the monsters kept ramming into trees and the mountainside. Don't worry, Rusty. I'll try to help. The pounding of hooves echoed through the forest like thunder. Suddenly, an ashram slammed into a living armor just as it was forming beside them. Several more crashed into it moments later. Gwen squeezed her eyes shut and chanted as if her life depended on it. Rusty kept her slung over his shoulder and continued running. He was not particularly fast, but at least his stamina was endless. The glowing skulls of the ashrams began colliding not only with the environment but also with the living armors that Gwen continued to summon. Even the floating imps managed to distract them. The creatures crashed into trees, rocks, armors, and even into one another. The trees, they're collapsing and burning. Rusty glanced back and saw flames spreading through the forest behind them. Even though the woods were nearly frozen, dozens of flaming ram heads had somehow managed to set them ablaze. Branches cracked and crashed to the ground. Entire trees toppled across the slope as the stampeding ashrams smashed through everything in their path. The forest was rapidly transforming into a burning corridor of destruction. Just keep distracting them. We're getting closer. Rusty tightened his grip on Gwen and pushed his speed as far as he could. By this point, they had already been moving through the forest for close to an hour, and the burning woods behind them would serve as a clear signal to anyone who might come to their rescue. The monsters continued their pursuit, and soon another problem arose. My mana. I can't summon anything anymore. Gwen had finally run out of mana while distracting the monsters chasing them. To make matters worse, the forest they had been using as cover was beginning to thin out. There were fewer and fewer trees ahead. Then, without warning, they emerged into a clearing that ended at a steep mountain wall. Maybe if I still had my wraith form, but like this. I can't climb it. Rusty turned to look at the approaching monsters. They were still closing in, and his current body was poorly suited for climbing. Even if he managed it, he doubted Gwen would be able to hold onto his back for long. Letting her inside his body was not an option either, as the added weight would likely make them slip. They seemed completely trapped. Gwen, get up on that ledge. If you can, try climbing higher. But what about you, Rusty? Don't worry about me. I'll stop them here. The ledge was narrow, but at least it placed her above the direct path of the charging monsters. Gwen, stay there no matter what happens. Rusty stepped away from the cliff and positioned himself between the approaching herd and the narrow ledge. His shield was larger than before, and he had gained more mass, but his luck finally ran out when the ashram variant he had been worried about appeared. It stood nearly a full head taller than the others and was considerably broader. The flames within its skull burned brighter, and its horns were far more pronounced. It charged straight at him and slammed into his shield. The impact echoed through the clearing, and even with his increased size, Rusty felt the shock reverberate through his metallic joints. This thing is D+. Rusty dug his feet into the frozen ground as the larger ashram continued to push against his shield. The pressure was on a completely different level from that of the other ordinary monsters. Cracks spread beneath his boots, and he was slowly driven backward. To make matters worse, more ashrams rushed him from both sides. Rusty. I'm fine. Just stay there. The larger ram finally pulled back and immediately charged again. The smaller one slammed into the sides of his shield, forcing him even closer to the rocky wall behind him, but he held his ground. Although his durability was high, dents were beginning to appear across his body, and the rising heat from the repeated impacts was causing his metal frame to grow hotter and hotter. What should I do? If he only had to worry about himself, the situation would have been simple. But protecting Gwen changed everything. If any of the rams crashed into the wall behind him, she would almost certainly fall from the ledge. Yet just as he was considering whether to activate his buffing skills or perhaps use his new chain ability, he noticed a strange shadow moving across the ground. What is that? For a moment, he glanced up and saw a massive 8-legged creature skittering silently across the wall. It was not alone. 2 people rode on its back, both of them familiar, while a third ran alongside it. Aren't those? One of the ashrams charged at him, but before it could reach him, a sticky thread coated in purplish liquid shot down from the giant spider above. The monster's legs became entangled, and it screamed in pain as the poison sizzled through its flesh. You! Gwen! Astralla's voice rang out from atop the spider, and moments later the summoned creature landed beside him. Arania, its master, was there as well, and the two were not alone. In his fused form, Sibur descended like a bolt of lightning, driving his claws into the side of another charging ashram before landing on the ground. Rusty had no idea how the 3 of them had managed to get here, but with them at his side, he was certain this battle could finally be won. I wasn't expecting any help. Rusty watched as the giant spider reared back, its many eyes gleaming in the reflection of the burning forest. Arania did not say anything, but the spider carried out her will through the rider bond they shared. It spat streams of purplish poison from its fangs, launching them like mana arrows. Whenever they struck their targets, sharp impacts echoed across the clearing as the venom splashed against fur and bone. The corrosive poison ate through hides and left smoking wounds behind. Arania's giant spider did not stop after a single volley. More streams of poison shot from its fangs, coating the battlefield with deadly traps. Any monster that stepped into the puddles immediately began to struggle. The spider remained above them, dancing just out of reach of the ashrams, whose only method of attack was charging in straight lines, or so they thought. The stronger variant opened its bony maw, and flames erupted toward them. The blast scorched the section of mountainside where the spider had been standing, forcing it to descend, but the girls managed to stay safe. Then, just as the monster prepared to unleash another breath attack, a powerful blow struck its head and sent it reeling backward. Your opponent is me! Sibur shouted as raw power surged through his feline claws. His fused tiger and humanoid form was larger than before, with greater muscle mass and bright orange fur. His speed was equally impressive as he gracefully avoided the lesser ashrams while they attempted to trample him. The larger variant shook its head, the flames within its skull burning brighter with rage as it locked its gaze onto Sibur. It snorted a cloud of sparks and charged, its hooves tearing through the frozen earth. Sibur did not try to stop it head-on as Rusty had. Instead, he waited until the last possible moment, leaped into the air, and flipped over the beast. As he descended, his claws carved deep gashes into its flank, drawing more of that thick, dark demonic blood. Meanwhile, Astrella slid down from the giant spider's back and hurried toward the small ledge where Gwen was huddled. Gwen! Are you hurt? Astrella called out, her eyes scanning her friend for injuries. I'm fine, just out of mana. Gwen replied, her voice trembling slightly but filled with relief. Astrella quickly pulled a mana recovery potion from her belt and handed it over. Rusty took it and passed it to his summoner. After a few hurried gulps, color began returning to Gwen's face as her mana slowly recovered. You two stay here. I'll take care of the rest. Rusty nodded and lifted Astrella onto the elevated ledge before moving forward to assist Sibur and Arania. Although their surprise attack had been successful, the number of flaming rams continued to grow. The noise is drawing them in, Rusty said as he plunged his halberd into one of the ashrams. Astrella immediately nodded and began chanting. Leave it to me and the fairies. I'll block out the sound and strengthen your abilities, so go wild. The air warped as Astrella finished her incantation. A soft, shimmering barrier of pale green light rippled outward from the ledge, expanding until it formed a dome over the clearing. The moment the spell settled into place, the thunderous noise of the battle vanished, trapped within the magical barrier. Wisps of wind spiraled around Rusty, Sibur, and Arania, lifting the weight from their limbs and filling them with renewed strength. Even though Rusty was in his Goliath form, the increase in agility helped him greatly during the battle. He endured as many hits as he could, using his provocation skill to keep the monsters focused on him. His shield was enough to block most of their attacks and gave Sibur, who had managed to finish off the stronger variant, an opportunity to land a critical strike. Yet the monsters kept coming in numbers no one had imagined possible. Even other creatures, such as hobgoblins that were probably native to these parts, could be seen peeking out from the trees. Fortunately, they were not alone. Why is it getting so cold? Gwen asked while shivering. Astrella responded by pointing toward the sky. Look! There, their teacher Quinton and his ice elemental had arrived. Not just one, but 3 ice elementals descended from above while Quinton stood on a strange icy platform that slowly lowered through the air. Without even raising a wand, he directed his summoned creatures. They immediately began launching spears of ice at the rampaging horde below. The frozen projectiles rained down like a crystalline barrage, piercing through the thick hides of the ashrams and shattering the fiery skulls with ease. Wherever the ice struck, frost spread rapidly across the ground, sealing the beasts' wounds and freezing them solid within seconds. Even the burning trees that threatened to ignite the forest were quickly extinguished beneath the sudden blizzard. Quinton hovered above the battlefield, his eyes focused as his hands moved smoothly through the air. The 3 ice elementals acted in perfect synchronization, raising walls of frost that cut off approaching reinforcements and funneled the remaining monsters into a narrow bottleneck. Then, once the students had retreated to a safe distance, the barrage intensified even further. The hobgoblins never had a chance to flee. A storm of ice swept across the forest's edge and consumed everything in its path. Trees crackled as frost raced up their trunks. Snow and frozen mist surged outward in a widening wave. The unfortunate monsters caught at the edge of the battlefield were instantly encased in thick layers of ice before they could retreat into the woods. This is... Rusty did not know how to react. He had thought that becoming a D-rank monster made him somewhat powerful, but even without being the direct target of the blizzard, he knew he would be frozen solid within seconds. Lightning magic might not be my only weakness. His joints groaned as he took a few steps back from the newly formed ice wall. Returning to where Gwen and the others stood, he watched as silence settled over the battlefield. The flaming skulls mounted on the rams were gone, and the thunderous pounding they had produced was no more. The only sound that remained was the crackling of ice spreading across the landscape, extending for at least 200 meters in a half-moon around them. If I ever get caught in a massive ice attack like this, I might be done for. To Rusty, whose identity revolved around struggle and combat, this display of power was concerning. However, he already had an idea of how to address the problem. Heat enchantments. If he could place them throughout his body, then even if he were frozen and unable to move, he could eventually thaw himself out. Ice would not kill him directly like lightning could. It would only immobilize his metallic body. Quinton's platform of solid ice finally landed on the ground. Now that it was here, he could see something resembling a fence forming around its edges. A small entrance appeared as well, and moments later, the teacher stepped through it. His usually passive expression looked quite different now as he frowned deeply. Astrella Fjord, Sibber Tygrys, and even you, Lady Arania Venomridge. Explain your actions. Well, Astrella began mumbling something under her breath as the teacher glared at her. Sibber was next. Even though he was still in his transformed form, he looked afraid to meet Quinton's gaze through the monocle. Only Arania faced the look directly, and she was also the one to answer. We could not let a fellow classmate die, Professor. Is that not what thou hast taught us? She did not back down, and the others found comfort in her confidence. Her status was quite high. Even though she was only a student, she was still of noble birth and ranked above the teacher. However, Quinton did not seem pleased with her response. All of you will be punished later. For now, we shall return to the waypoint. Are any of you injured? With a simple gesture, the icy gate opened, and the teacher beckoned them inside. Rusty and the others exchanged glances before nodding without complaint. All of them knew it was better not to argue with their teacher. Rusty's form shrank back to its smaller size, and the same happened to the spider. Sibber dismissed his transformation and returned to normal. Once Gwen and Astrella climbed down from the ledge, they all gathered on the icy platform, which carried them upward. It was a silent trip back. The platform moved relatively slowly as it ascended the mountain. While there, none of the students dared utter a word. They did not want to further upset the teacher, who would likely be deciding their punishment later. Rusty, however, reached out to Gwen through their summoner bond. Is everything going to be all right? I don't know. We still have a few days before we reach the Night Academy, so I doubt the punishment will be too harsh. But after we return to the academy... Gwen trailed off, concern evident in her tone. Rusty could feel her anxiety through their bond, but he doubted she would get into serious trouble. This group consisted of prestigious summoners, a rare bunch from what he had seen. Considerable resources had been invested in their safety, and their teacher was clearly quite powerful. I think it'll be fine. Maybe they'll deduct some merit points or something. Everyone managed to get out alive, and that has to count for something. I hope so. The ice platform glided smoothly over the frozen peaks, leaving the devastated forest far behind. Up here, the wind no longer howled. Even though they were surrounded by ice elementals, the humanoids had stopped shivering. Eventually, they arrived back at the road. It was marked by countless hoofprints left behind by the ashram stampede, but there was something else waiting for them as well. A large group of armored soldiers stood there, clearly awaiting their arrival. As soon as the platform came into view, they began waving and making room for it to land. Once they touched down, Rusty noticed rows of dead monster corpses piled along the roadside while soldiers hauled them away. It had been a true slaughter. Shame that I don't get experience from these things directly. He had to have defeated tens of these ashrams already, but Gwen was the only one gaining experience. Still, he wasn't particularly upset. If she grew stronger, she would only be able to provide more mana for his own skills. Ah, finally safe. Astrella was the first to break the silence as she hopped off the frozen platform. Waiting before them was a smaller armored carriage, ready to transport them to the waypoint where the other students were gathered. It's all thanks to you and Professor Quinton. Gwen smiled, trying to ease the tension, but the teacher simply looked at her and pointed toward the carriage before she could say anything more. Please get into the carriage. Why yes, Professor. She nodded and lowered her head slightly. The other students looked at her with frowns but said nothing. They climbed inside and took their seats, with Sibber on one side and the three girls on the other. The summons sat beside the only young man in the group. Quinton eventually climbed onto the driver's seat, and the horses, strangely coated in ice, finally started moving. I'm sorry. Because of me, all of you are going to be punished. Gwen finally spoke as the carriage rolled forward. Oh, please. Don't look like that, Gwen. We chose to go after you. Besides, seeing Sibber try to look tough while Quinton stared him down was worth every lost merit point. Astrella was the first to wave the apology away, a bright smile returning to her face. What are you talking about? You clung to my leg and begged me to help save Gwen with tears in your eyes. We were just lucky that Arania happened to overhear your pathetic sobbing and decided to lend us her spider. I wasn't sobbing. You were. The two immediately fell into another argument. Arania, who had been sitting quietly until now, began to chuckle. The sound grew louder and louder until, as though a dam had burst, she broke into hearty laughter. It was not something anyone in the carriage had expected. The sudden outburst stunned everyone into silence. They had all assumed she was a noble lady of few words, almost stoic in her behavior. Yet now she was laughing so hard that tears filled her eyes as she covered her face. For a few moments, nobody knew how to react. Then Gwen started laughing as well, followed by Astrella and Sibber, as though her laughter had somehow become contagious. The carriage filled with laughter for nearly 20 seconds before Arania finally managed to compose herself. Ah, thou art an interesting bunch. Please forgive my outburst. She raised her fan to cover her mouth, but her little spider familiar continued bouncing excitedly beside Rusty, as though it too had been affected by her sudden change in mood. Ah, you're quite an interesting person too, Lady Arania. And I'd also like to thank you for helping us. Gwen smiled at the pale girl, who immediately seemed to blush. Think nothing of it. It's what any Venomridge would have done. It was clear that the young noblewoman was not accustomed to speaking with children her own age. Rusty remained silent as the group continued talking around him. I wonder. After this incident, they still did not know who the culprit was. It was also possible that the flaming goats were somehow part of the attack on Gwen. Yet he was not thinking about the identity of his enemy. Instead, his thoughts were focused on the group before him. This was not the first time he had been summoned to this world. Through multiple missions, he had managed to help Gwen not only by winning battles but also by helping her gather like-minded companions, something humanoids usually called friends or allies. Even when he was gone, these three people would remain by his summoner's side and help her overcome whatever obstacles lay ahead. Because of this, he began to wonder if these missions were far more significant than he had first assumed. Life continued in these worlds even after he left, and helping his summoner build strong relationships could be an important piece of a much larger puzzle. I'll have to protect these three as well. At this point, they make a great team. Arania, who had once seemed like an enemy, was becoming one of their greatest allies. Her spider was powerful, and her family was influential as well. She was probably not the one targeting his summoner, as there would be little reason for her to help Gwen in this situation if she were. That meant they still needed to uncover the true culprit. This time, it would be best for all of them to put their heads together and figure out what was really going on.